I really envy your certainty, and it's great work that's been done. And in just following on from Oliver, I totally agree that the political barriers are there, and I'm reminded of John Milton, who said that sometimes it's better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, and there's a bit of that goes on too. So I'm focused beyond 2030, really looking at it takes so long to develop new grids. I'm focused beyond 2030 out to 2050, and I see a need for a lot of new grids. Next slide, please. And really, you have to ask yourself, what do we need? And it's trying to look ahead. It takes so long to do this, and based on a lot of benchmarking and the European, the 1.5 new tech scenario, and the amount of increase in electrification and so on, we see a demand over an increase of 2 to 3 times by 2050. Now that's a huge amount of grid, and there's two things going on that we see, and one is we're turning off all the carbon machines and we're turning up the renewables. So Giles will talk later about the offshore piece, I'm sure, but there's 450 gigawatts at least of offshore wind. There is more again of onshore wind, and about 800 gigawatts of new solar required. And the best resources and the best load factors are to be found at the peripheries. And that brings together two things: gigawatts remote from load centers that are all going to be at the center. So you got your kilometers and your gigawatts. And that's going to put a lot more demands in terms of the transmission, in terms of that being a bottleneck or a constraint on our ability to decarbonize. And the most efficient way to move power is with transmission lines. And we know that, and the question is will we be able to get enough of them? Now, we know there's low public acceptance. In the past, I've developed overhead infrastructure. It's very challenging, particularly in Europe. And also, if you look at the quantity of transmission that's required, you start worrying about supply chains. So copper, can we continue to extract it and get those level of grids? And it's for those reasons that it's nice to focus on 2030, but beyond 2030, there's a lot of ambiguity about the type of grids we're going to need. Like people talk about the system of systems and so on and so on, but how much transmission are we going to need? And there's a lot of ambiguity about that. And that's understandable, but we can't ignore it, because there's no point charging towards 2030 and getting stuck, because it takes a long time to develop the kind of grids that I believe we're going to need. Next slide, please. So Europe is not unique, and mine is a European perspective, but there are other major commercial blocks, and they've got the same challenges, like in China, where a huge amount of the demand is on their east coast, and their best renewables and generation is in the north and northwest. And they've done an incredible project there, where they've built a 3,324 kilometer line. Now, this isn't just any line, it's the single biggest piece of transmission infrastructure in the world. It's 1100 kV, it's 12 gigawatts, it's a DC overhead line. The towers are absolutely enormous. And I just bring your attention, this is about 2 years in operation now, it's the second year of operation. These are people on one of the poles doing a bit of maintenance. So if you look to one of the poles, there's a plus and a minus. This represents 40,000 gigawatt kilometers. So that's a lot more transmission capacity to move power from A to B than Europe has built in many years. And it's just incredible infrastructure, and it'll work in China. I don't think it'll work in Europe, and certainly not in many parts of America. But that's the type of infrastructure that's required to decarbonize, to do deep decarbonisation. Next slide, please. So I've got 4 significant reference points here, and 2 of them are pros and 2 of them are cons. And if I focus on the left, the Florence School of Regulation, a venerable body, produced a report late last year where no less than former Andreas Peebalgs and a former head of DG Energy came up with a report supported by the Florence School of Regulation and the people behind them, they're experts. And they said that apart from energy efficiency, which is really, really important, the most important and immediate priority for the European Union and the whole continent of Europe in ensuring a cost-effective decarbonisation of its energy system must be to identify and eliminate infrastructure and other bottlenecks. So I think generation technology, it's fantastic. The price of wind, the technology, the solar, it's just been incredible. And they're really pointing towards the big bottleneck's going to be our ability to move it from where we can generate it to where we can consume it. The second point is a quote, just back a slide, please. Yeah, from Acer in 2019, where they said that a recurring theme is that almost half the PCIs, which are projects of common interest in Europe, have been shifted. So their dates of delivery have been delayed because of holdups in the public planning process due to issues with public acceptability and so on. So there's a real issue in Europe to develop the kind of infrastructure we need. Now, I'm a developer of technology and not grid enabling technology for 2030, but for beyond 2030. And we're working on superconductivity, which needs a smaller right of way. And there's been a lot of work done, and there's some great projects that the European Union have sponsored under the Horizon Best Paths, where they come up with the largest superconducting DC line in the world, which was a 320 kV 8 gigawatt circuit, which is the type of power you need to move in a future where electricity takes over transport and heating pumping, where you see a threefold increase in the amount of electricity. You're going to need a lot more grids. So tweaking it will help us get to 2030 and grid enabling technology. But beyond that, we're going to need lots of new grids. And I think HVDC cables have been seen by the SETIR report, which is the clean energy transition. The first report was done last year, and it has recognised that there are technologies that can get us there. So I'll go to the next slide, please. And I think just a little bit about superconductivity first, because some people think it's a strange phenomena that's in a lab somewhere. This is something that's been operational with progressive utilities in Chicago, in Germany, and in Korea, where they've actually got it in use in urban environments. But it's got four very interesting attributes. Firstly, it's no resistance, so there are no losses, so it's really efficient. Secondly, it's high power density, so you can fit a lot of power in a very small space, which is very useful when way leaves are a challenge and building infrastructure is a challenge. And finally, the cost can be lower if the scale is high enough. So it mightn't make sense to move a megawatt 100 kilometers, but it might make sense to move a gigawatt 100 kilometers. So it's just a question of scale. And the scales we're moving to, we think the superconductivity is now becoming a real option for operators and developers to move their power from A to B and to get it done quicker and to accelerate and enable the transition. Next slide, please. This is a view of the future, and I would say there are probably more holes in this than in Swiss cheese, because we're actually looking out to 2050 with the scenarios as espoused by the European Commission and others, the IEA and others, and we're looking at them and we're saying, how can this be met and how could you dispatch such a system? So we looked at a winter afternoon in Europe, typical wind dispatch, low solar, high wind in the North Sea, and we split Europe into 5 regions. So we had Ireland and the UK, the Nordic region, Central Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, and then the southeast of Europe. And we split it because we didn't want it to be too granular, because there's a lot of uncertainty here. And we looked at 2 scenarios, one where we continue with a nationalistic approach to grids with interconnection. And you can see the transfers are absolutely, they're significant. So 13 gigawatts into the Iberian Peninsula, 13 gigawatts into Central Europe, and then to the larger amounts into Central Europe from Scandinavia and down into southeast of Europe. And this is a European vision, so there's very little external interconnection here. This is very much a European-centric study. And you can see that you need about 3,200 gigawatts of generation and storage. On the right is a pan-European grid, which is truly a European grid, not interconnection, the national grids. It's a European approach. And you can see larger flows. So there's a totally unconstrained dispatch where there's hundreds of gigawatts transferring. That's not credible or realistic. This is a pan-European approach where grid is a constraint, but not to the same extent as under a business as usual approach. And you can see a saving of 15% with the pooled aggregate. So back to Oliver's point about being a no-brainer to build interconnection, it's a no-brainer to build a lot more grid. And I believe that the arguments are becoming more and more compelling. And the real thing here is the amount of money you save by having to build less renewables to meet demand and saving money by doing it. So I put a health warning on this because it's a view of 2050, which is so far away. But I believe we have to take a view of the future to plot a way there. And while it will be uncertain and there will be changes, it's important to have it. So this is what we're using, and this is why we're developing technology for that eventuality. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot.
I've gotten through a lot.
Thanks